Hey everyone, I am Sam from Xploding Cube, and in this video we're going to be discussing lighting. Lighting is a very important and oftentimes overlooked topic in 3D rendering. I know myself that after spending time modeling, texturing, and sculpting and so on, I'll be looking at my model and feeling really proud of myself. I'll be very eager to get right ahead into rendering, and I won't have much patience to spend time setting up proper lighting. It's very tempting to slap down a few lights and say, if it doesn't look good, I'll just fix it in post. However, lighting is a very important step and shouldn't be rushed and overlooked, because our choice of lights can make or break a final render. When we're working on our models in a digital 3D environment, we can observe our model from any view we want. But after we render our scene, the model is stamped into whatever view we've decided on. The model now exists in a locked and unchanging perspective, which means we should do whatever we can to set up our model and show it off clearly. And that's where lighting comes in. The purpose of good lighting is to show off your model and properly describe the 3D form. Based off our lighting, we should be telling the viewer what form is in front, what's in back, is it round, is it flat, and so on. This visual description establishes the structure and allows the viewer to properly read the form. But the truth is that in addition to simply illuminating the model and showing off all of its details, the light setup can dramatically affect the final render by how it's lighting the model. Lighting directly influences mood and sets a tone for how we want our subject to be perceived by our audience. It can help to reinforce if we want our render to look happy, sad, scary, funny, etc. Just a side note, there are other factors that contribute to the portrayal of our render, such as our camera and material setup, and we will touch on these subjects very briefly in relation to lighting. Okay, back to lights. Now, say you've spent a lot of time working on a project, maybe a few days or a few weeks or even a few months, and now finally you're ready to render it. Time to set up those lights. But where do you begin? I mean, you know how important lighting is. You've listened to me go on and on about it, but what's the first step? I mean, where should we put the light? Do we need more than one light? How many lights do we need? How intense should they be? Should it be warm or cold lighting? There are so many questions and so many choices. It seems like too many, and it can be overwhelming. Well, don't fret, because it doesn't need to be complicated. Because lucky for us, there is something called 3-point lighting. Now, before everyone starts to groan and complain, let me say that I know that 3-point lighting is kind of a cliche and almost generic at this point, but it's popular because it's so easy and because it looks good. I use it for most of my renders, and I found that once you understand the basic principles, this setup can be very versatile. At the very least, it could be used as a base to play around with and customize to your needs. So anyway, after that whole preamble, you might be asking, okay Sam, what the flip is 3-point lighting? Well, I'm really glad you asked, because 3-point lighting is, as it sounds, 3 lights set up in a way to light the subject from varying angles and intensities, in order to describe the form and hopefully make it look cool along the way. I've gone ahead and rendered out a few stills from a very basic scene to show the 3-point light setup in action. Let me just bring up the first still here. Okay, here we have our scene. Just a 3D sphere being lit from the front by the default scene lighting. Not very interesting, but more importantly, not very descriptive. It's hard to tell if this is indeed a 3D sphere or just a 2D circle. So let's add in our first light. This here is our key light, or sometimes called the hero light. This is the dominating light that should be used to establish general form and set the mood for our scene. We've set our key light at upper screen right in order to favor one side of the sphere. This asymmetry adds visual interest as well as helps us understand the form as we see the light start as a hot spot and get gradually weaker until being completely obscured by the form. However, this still doesn't make the cut. Although we've offset our light and added some asymmetry, This sphere is still pretty binary. It's either on light or complete shadow. And that brings us to our second light, namely the fill light. The purpose of this light is to brighten broad areas that are obscured from our key light. The fill light is usually placed at an opposing angle to the key light, as we have done in our still. We put the fill light at lower screen left, and it's also usually weaker than the key light so that the shadows still read as shadows. These two lights combined get us really close to our goal. But for that last 10%, that little bit more that can really make the model pop, we bring in our rim light. The purpose of this light is to catch glancing angles and to highlight severe plane changes within the form. Also, this light is very commonly used to separate the model from the background and other objects. The rim light's intensity can range anywhere from extreme to subtle, depending on what you want. Let's check a look at a viewport render of our scene so we can better see how our lights are set up. Here at upper screen right, we can see our key light in red and how it's illuminating most of the ball. At bottom screen left, we see our fill light in blue, illuminating the area obscured from the key light. And finally, from behind the ball at mid-screen left, we can see our rim light catching a sliver of the silhouette, illuminating the ball in green. This is the bare basics of a three-point light setup. Let's move on to some practical examples of three-point lighting in action. But before we do, there is one more thing that I want to address, and that is camera setup. The camera can be angled in many different ways, but for simplicity and time's sake, let's break it down to three basic shots. We have the frontal view, the three-quarter view, and the profile view. The frontal angle has the subject facing the camera head-on. This can give the impression that the character is engaging us, the viewer, and can seem to amplify the character's emotions. The three-quarter angle is the most common and the most flattering for portrait photography. The profile angle is very uncommon and can be challenging and awkward, but not impossible to work with. Overall, each angle has pros and cons and should be used accordingly. Okay, so with this in mind, we want to approach our scene setup by first asking ourselves, how do we want to portray our subject? Let's take a look at our first example. This is a character that we sculpted previously. If you haven't seen it, you can check it out, link in the description. The first thing we should note about this young lady is that she is facing the camera at a three-quarter view. The character is meant to look soft and delicate. Her smile is timid and her head is tilting down and away from us. Everything about this character is looking shy and soft-spoken, and the lighting is helping to reinforce this attitude. We can see the transition from light to shadow is very soft and subtle. The brightness in the light and dark areas are pretty even and not too severe. But even with this very tempered lighting, the forms still read nicely thanks to three-point lighting. Our main light, namely the key light, is shining down from upper screen right, catching upward and right-facing planes and illuminating most of the character. It's also casting shadows under the bangs, the smile line, the bottom lip, the head onto the neck, and most of screen left, as well as other nooks and crannies. The key light is a large diffused light that makes soft shadows, but catches specular highlights on various areas with angle changes, such as the hair, the cheekbone, the side and tip of the nose, and the pearls and gold chain. Additionally, the key light is reaching over and forming a little pocket of light just beneath the eye to the screen left side of the character, and even catching a sliver of the bottom of the iris. This is a very subtle and barely noticeable effect, but little things like this go a long way. The fill light in this case is a dome light at a very low intensity. This is like having a giant reflector around the character, which brightens the shadows and gives them even lighting. Last but not least, we have our rim light from behind the character at mid-upper screen left, which is being used to break up the even lighting in the hair, outline the left side of the nose, help to separate the left side of the neck from the bottom of the chin, and also to add some interest to the left cheekbone and separate it from the hair. This is a basic overview of one example. Let's take a look at another. Here we have our big hairy uncle. Every family has got one. This guy is approachable, cheery, and goofy looking. Notice the camera is placed right in front of him. He's not posing or showing off. He's just saying cheese, eyes wide open and smiling right at us. There are no airs about him and a complete lack of self-awareness. By the way, if you want to see the sculpting video for this character, you can check it out, link in the description. Okay, so let's continue to break down this character and analyze why it's lit this way. As we can see from this 3/4 WIP still, the character is mostly round and smooth, with very few flat planes or hard edges. His head shape resembles a giant pear, and his features are mostly composed of spherical shapes like his eyes, cheeks, chin, and so on. We want our character to look friendly, so he should be brightly lit and have soft shadows. However, this character presents a different challenge than our previous example. This guy here has a really prominent nose, and if we placed our key light to the side of the character, then we would lose a lot of light due to his nose and the overall roundness of his head. So, what can we do to fix this? We could try to bring the key light around towards the front, but as we saw from our simple example with the sphere, frontal lighting can have a flattening effect on forms, and that's not what we want here. So, instead, let's place it from more of a top-down direction. This way, we can catch upward-facing planes, like the top and tip of the nose, top of the cheek, the nostril, and chin. We are even catching a little bit of the cheek and upper lip on the shadowed side. This downward lighting is also giving a nice gradient effect over the character. The top of his head, starting down with the forehead, is really bright, but gets gradually dimmer as it makes its way down. This adds variation and helps to break flat lighting. Moving on to our fill light, it's pretty much identical to our previous example. It's a simple dome light at a very low intensity to brighten the shadows and give them more even lighting. And that brings us to our rim light. In this case, the rim light is coming from behind the character at screen right, in a slightly downward direction. This is helping to bring shapes out of the shadows and show depth as it wraps around forms and brings them in front of others, like the chin from the jowls, the cheek from the character's temple, the edge of the bottom lip, tip of the nose, and the fold in the collar. It's even helping to define the squareness of the nose by brightening that one side we have there. One final thing to note before moving on is the contrast in temperature between the key and rim lights. The key light is warm and the rim is cool. This helps reinforce the character's color theme of bright yellows and reds against cool purples and blues. Okay, moving on to our next example, we have a very unusual looking character in a profile view. Normally, I don't use the profile angle, but this guy is sculpted from an awesome concept designed by my brother, so I rendered him from that same angle. Once again, if you want to see the sculpting process of this guy, you can browse the videos on our channel or click the link in the description. Okay, so let's break down this character. What shape does he most closely resemble? Well, he's pretty much a giant cylinder with a nose and ear popping out. Sure, he's got other features, but they're small and don't contribute strongly to form. In fact, this character's most defining attribute is his distinct silhouette. After this analysis, how should we go about lighting this character? Well, for starters, let's remember that our subject is in a profile view. We only have one half of him visible. We can only see one of his eyes, one of his ears, half of his nose, and half of his mouth. So if one of these features isn't showcased properly, we can't rely on its other half to show through. That means we have to be decisive which side we want our key light to favor. In this case, it's pretty obvious that we want the character's face to be the focal point, so let's put our key light at upper screen right. This will illuminate upward and right-facing planes and also catch specular reflections on various areas to indicate directional changes in the forms. This also gives us a nice vertical gradient of brightness from top to bottom, like we saw in our previous example. Now that we have that figured out, let's address some of those shadows with a fill light placed at lower screen left and aiming slightly up to brighten those left and downward facing planes. Finally, we come to our rim light, which presents another challenge. Namely, what details can we accentuate on this character? He doesn't have too many, and the few that he does have are being handled by our key light and would be difficult to reach anyhow. The solution to this challenge is something we already mentioned about this character, and that is that his most defining feature is his silhouette. So let's accentuate that by turning our rim light into a backlight. We do this by placing the rim light behind the character, towards the middle of our shot. This will cast a halo of light on our character and outline his silhouette. When placing our backlight, however, we should be careful not to arrange it directly centered behind the character, but rather a little to screen left and slightly aiming up. This is in order to brighten the downward and left-facing planes more than the others, so we can avoid competing with the bright areas already being lit by the key light, and also to avoid a completely uniform outline around the character, which would be boring and also make him look like he's glowing, which would be kinda weird. So with that, we have our character lit up pretty well, and I think we're about ready to move on to our next example. But one last thing to take note of before moving on is that, like in the previous example, there is a temperature contrast of cool and warm colors that is also being reinforced by the warmness of the key light and the coolness of the fill and backlight. Okay. Let's take a look at one final example that has a couple of new features to it. I'll make this quick because I don't want our video to go on too long. Here we have Batman sculpted to resemble the 1989 movie. You can check out the sculpting process by visiting our channel library or click the link in the description. In this case, we want our subject to look cool and dramatic, so the camera is arranged to a 3/4 view. Regarding the light setup, Batman is a tough, dark character, and we want our lighting to support that theme. Our key light is shining down from upper screen left, the fill is a dome light with an HDR plugged in, and the rim light is slightly aimed up from behind the character at screen right. Our lighting is harsh with areas of intense light to contrast the areas of intense black, along with the overall darkness of the render. However, there is something additionally interesting about our key light and the shadows it's casting. Let me pull up a clay render of the character so we could better see what's going on with the light and shadows. By the way, check out our ArtStation. We usually put up a couple of different renders of our projects if you want to see WIPs, wireframes, and stuff like that. Okay. So here in our clay render, we can get a better idea of what our lights are doing to our model. We can see both subtle and dramatic differences in the brightness depending on the angle and proximity of the forms. Those areas that are closer to the light are brighter, the areas that recede are darker. The forms that face the light are brighter, the forms that face away are darker. However, there is something else about the lighting that's giving variation to our render. Take a look and see if you can notice anything different about our shadows. If you're saying that the shadows are both hard and soft, then you are correct, because like light, shadows come in a variety of forms, and depending on its nature, we can tell a lot about our subject. Let me explain. In general, there are two types of shadows: form shadows and cast shadows. Form shadows are formed as an object's surface turns away from its light source. The steepness or shallowness in the surface's angle will determine the nature of the shadow. For example, on screen right, the area of Batman's cheek that is facing the rim light is being illuminated. However, as the form slowly turns away, it transitions softly into shadow. The transition beyond that is abrupt as the form changes angle rapidly, causing a hard-edged shadow to form. This visual info is extremely useful to help us understand the surface angle of our subject. Now, whereas form shadows are caused and defined by the surface itself, cast shadows, on the other hand, are caused by one form obstructing the light source and casting another form into shadow. This is apparent in a few places on our model, such as the brow casting a shadow over the eye on screen left, the cowl nose casting over the mouth and chin, and the head casting across the neck. How our surface receives these shadows can tell us a lot about its form as well as add visual interest. For example, notice the changes in direction and general waviness in the cast shadow across the neck as it travels over the molded neck muscles and clavicle of the cowl. The cowl nose is casting a shadow onto the screen left cheek, giving us a stair-step effect, and also combining with the form shadows to give us a solid block of shadow with edges of varying softness and hardness. Depending on the mood of your shot, you may want to accentuate or mitigate the effect of cast shadows, since it can give a harshness to your subject, which works perfectly in this case for Batman. One last thing to mention about this render is how the effects of our light change depending on the materials we use. In our clay render, the outer edge of the bat ear at screen right is darker, and in the shaded render, the ear is brighter. This is due to a higher reflectivity in our rubber material, picking up the HDR image in our fill light. There are other examples of differences between our renders due to the shaders, but for time's sake, let's move on to a working demo. Alright then, here we are inside of Cinema 4D, my personal 3D package of choice, but it doesn't make a difference if you're using Maya, Blender, or Houdini, and so on. Especially if you're using a third-party renderer like I am. In this case, I'll be using Arnold to render my shot. So, looking at the scene, we have our character in the center at a 3/4 view, looking very alluring and a little dangerous. For this shot, what I have in mind is I'm thinking of a classic noir scene with nice contrast, but overall pretty dark. For time's sake, I've gone ahead and arranged the lights into place, but we can take a look at them and see how they're combining to give us a desired effect. Our key light is placed at upper screen left pointing down, and the goal here is to make her eye area a focal point by brightening it and the surrounding areas. I want to catch her forehead, the top of her cheekbone, and her nose, and generally brighten top-facing planes and the closer half of the character. I want the shadows to be soft and moody, and the farther half of the character to be left in shadow to add some mystery to her character. Let's go ahead and fire off a render and see what it gives us. I'll be back in a sec. Okay, and we are back, and this is looking pretty good. We're getting good coverage and bringing attention to the focal point, but our shadows are too dark. So let's turn on our fill light, which is a dome light with an HDR at a very low intensity, and fire off another render. Be back in a tick. And we are back again, and this is our key and fill light together. It's looking pretty good, much better than before, but we still can do better. So let's activate our rim light at screen right and see what that gives us. Okay, that's looking pretty nice. Our rim light is adding much more drama and extra contrast with its higher intensity catching those glancing areas in the shadowed side. This, however, can still be improved, and it definitely should be improved with post-processing. However, this light setup gets us to a good point where most of the job is done and the work we have ahead of us is easy and not an uphill battle. All that's left for us to do is to enhance our image by messing with the levels and doing some minor color corrections. Well, I hope this was informative and will help you improve and have a better understanding of lighting and what you can achieve with it. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe, and let us know what you think. Bye!